involved in this further past tonight. In late November, I was given a tape by Gary Gilbertson, the pastor at the New Covenant Church in town. He said, "Here, Katie, you've got to listen to this guy. He's a Christian theologian, and this is a tape speaking about homosexuality with public policy and yada yada." I thought, thanks, and I took the tape and didn't listen to it for like 3 weeks because I had already prescribed a personality to John Rankin because of all the other people who hold that kind of conservative worldview. I already thought I knew what he was talking about, and then I heard the tape and was excited about having him come here and speak because he's really not status quo. It's not what you expect from someone who thinks that the Bible is completely trustworthy. He's actually nice. Unfortunately, it's not a combination that goes together that often. John Rankin is going to speak for 45 minutes to an hour, and we're going to open this up for discussion and questions. There's 3 mics one in each aisle, and we welcome anyone who has an opinion that is different from John Rankin's to have first dibs at asking questions. I'm sure that you'll feel as we get started here that this is a safe place to ask questions if you feel like you'd like to present something. John Rankin is the president and the founder of the Theological Education Institute in Hartford, Connecticut. He was raised an agnostic Unitarian and converted to an evangelical faith in 1967. He holds graduate degrees in theology from Gordon Conwell and Harvard and is the author of the soon-to-be-released book, First the Gospel and Then Politics. His Mars Hill Forum series is held on university campuses nationwide where he interacts with leading skeptics of his worldview. Some past guests include Paul Kurtz, co-director of the Humanist Manifesto 2 and founder of the world's largest secular humanist organization, John Spong, first Episcopal bishop to ordain practicing homosexuals, Barry Lynn, director of the Americans United for Separation of Church and State, Patricia Ireland, president of the National Organization for Women, and Nadine Strawson, president of the American Civil Liberties Union. Right now, let's take a minute and welcome John Rankin to the podium.
Well, good evening. I'm in trouble. It's been said that I'm nice, and now I have to follow through with that. But by God's grace, I will be able to do that. I want to share with you, just for a moment, why I do forums like these and what my agenda is. My agenda as an evangelical Christian is summed up in a seminar I teach in churches around the country, and I taught one last night, and it's called the Love of Hard Questions Seminar. I was raised an agnostic Unitarian in West Hartford, Connecticut. I was a PK. I don't know if any of you know what that is. A position statement. And I was taught from my upbringing in a very skeptical denomination to be skeptical. And so what happened with me is I became skeptical of those who taught me to be skeptical. And so that's why I'm no longer an agnostic Unitarian. But in all seriousness, I was taught to love hard questions, and this is the one thing I want to focus on tonight. Is there any concept of truth that governs our lives? Is there any truth that we base ourselves on? Is there truth in law? Is there truth in love? Is there truth in physics? Is there truth in math? Is there truth in morality? And if there is truth, and if we have a sense of looking for truth, are we willing to embrace the toughest questions en route to that truth? Not only that, do we view truth as bigger than us, or us as bigger than truth? And if truth is bigger than us, if we haven't created ourselves, if we haven't spoken this universe into being, then are we intellectually, relationally, emotionally honest enough to let truth change us? Now, I come to you tonight with some presuppositions and some convictions, and I'll put them on the table. My conviction is that the Bible on its own terms is true and trustworthy, and has the most beautiful prescription for human nature that there is. But because of the level of my confidence in that, the exact opposite of what you see many times in the caricature of those who are evangelicals is I believe that to try and cajole or force someone into truth itself opposes truth. Truth itself should convince itself by a process of informed choice. An informed choice cannot happen unless we are willing to ask hard questions. Therefore, to whatever level I have convictions, they are only true if they are true, and can only be understood to be true if I am always at all times willing to have them re-examined. Which is to say, the more confidence I have in something, the more willingness I should have people challenge that very confidence. So for example, if we believe 1 and 1 is 2, and I will assume most of us do, and someone comes and tries to challenge us on that, we're not really discomfited by that. But if on the other hand we believe something to be true, and yet we know we've got corners in our thinking, or we're not being quite honest, then we can become insecure. And so on that basis, my desire tonight, as I share with you my presuppositions and some of my observations on the subject at hand, is to raise questions, and then as you have questions in response during the Q&A, which is the part I enjoy the most, is to give me your most honest and straightforward questions. And I will consider it a compliment if you rate me over the coals with all the passion you have. Let me start with a provocative statement, at least I think it will be provocative for a few. Or actually, let me even try something else. And you don't have to raise your hand on this one because I don't want anyone to be on the spot. So I'm just looking for people who have conviction in one of two positions. The first question is, how many people here believe that sexual intimacy is valid outside of marriage, outside of heterosexual, faith, and monogamous marriage? How many people would say it's valid outside of marriage? Okay. How many people think it's valid only within marriage? Okay. About half, but most people didn't raise their hands. Okay. I want to make this observation, a provocative statement. And here's the statement for the evening. I believe that sex outside of marriage is the source of society's greatest evil. Another way I can put it is sex outside of marriage is society's greatest evil. Now let me give you an illustration of why I believe that to be the case. About 4 years ago, I was having a friend visit my office, and he works with the National Council of Churches, and his theology is defined as neo-Orthodox. I would be more in the Orthodox evangelical sense. So he's close to me in that sense. But his politics are defined in the classic liberal sense. And so he would believe the Bible and hold a lot of truth to it, but his positions when it comes to sexuality and public policy were quite different than my own. And he has a lot of wonderful work he does in inner city Hartford with the gangs. The gang members call them families, and actually that belies part of the social problem I'm looking at. But many things he does with the inner city gangs and the poor and issues of drugs and poverty and education, all of which I have a lot of respect for. And so we were talking about it, and we were sharing about some of these subjects. And then he said, because he knows that for years I headed up a pro-life group in New England for many years, and he knows I address issues of homosexuality, abortion, family, and questions like that. And he said, John, why do you spend so much of your time on, quote, sexual politics? He says, shouldn't you rather spend much more of your time dealing with injustice, racism, poverty, inner city woes, and so forth? And then I said, well, Roger, let me ask you this question. And this is about 4 years ago, and there was a recent study that came out at that time, and I referred him to it, and he was familiar with it. I said, Roger, have you seen this recent study that points out that between 70% and 90% of all men incarcerated for serious crimes grew up in functionally fatherless homes? Now, many of them absolutely, totally fatherless. Many of them had a father figure, but not in a stable way, so that's why the phrase functionally fatherless is what describes it. And yes, he'd seen that study. And I said, are you going to tell me then that sexual practice and fatherlessness does not affect social justice? You go inside the inner cities, and you'll find that the young boys, ages 10, 11, on following on up, who join the families, what we call the gangs, those of us who don't live in the inner city, they join it because it's an ersatz family. It's a replacement family to a family they have not had. And if you want to see violence, look at unfathered children. Children who don't have a father to tell them what is right and wrong and put the brakes on their wildness, particularly fathers and sons. And so they don't have the fathers, and in the inner city, particularly Hartford, it's the second smallest geographical city in the nation. It's only 18.4 square miles. The population is thinning out. The metro area is about 1.1 million. The city's down to 130,000. And the jobs that people who live in the inner city have are not in the city. They don't shop in the city. The school system is so bad, it's almost the most expensive in the country, about $12,000, $13,000 per head. And last year, both high schools were notified they were going to be disaccredited. For a public high school to be disaccredited is phenomenal. And this is the situation in Hartford. And so, in the middle of that city, if you are a young Hispanic boy or a young black boy, which are the two major minorities in the city, and you don't have a father, and you don't have income in the city, you don't have a good educational system, and you want money, what do? You sell drugs. And this is how that began to the quote families come into existence. You have your turfs, you protect your turfs, you get guns, you shoot each other, and there are drive-by shootings. In fact, one point, about 4 or 5 summers ago, we had national news on the number of drive-by shootings within blocks of my office in downtown Hartford. Many innocent people being killed. And so tremendous injustice, tremendous pain, tremendous poverty, and tremendous human suffering. And so what happens is those boys get in those gangs, and the girls get on drugs, they sell their bodies in prostitution, and then the cycle continues. It exacerbates, and you see a lot of evil that I believe passionately needs to be redressed. Back to my conversation with my friend with the National Council of Churches, or the local branch thereof. And so I said, Roger, if this is the case, and if you've got all the social evil which you are addressing, going back to fatherlessness, how does AFDC help fatherlessness? If you're familiar with aid to family with dependent children, if you are an inner city woman or a teenager, and you get pregnant and have a baby, and this is being reversed by some policies now, but for 20 years, you have a child, you will get more money from state support than if you married the father and he worked. And consequently, many women would have babies simply because of the money they would get. It's an assassination against marriage. We look at no-fault divorce laws going back to 1971 and how easy it is to get a divorce. And the pain that is reaped in divorce is principally upon the children. It is tremendously upon those who divorce, but the children are the innocent victims. And you see the social dysfunction that comes upon them in that process. And then you look at other issues such as abortion rights law and homosexuality laws that regard homosexuality as a valid family definition. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And I put all those issues before my friend, and I said, you don't think that sexual politics is not the root level issue? And he had nothing to say at that point. You see, because he was reacting to a stereotype. And the stereotype was that a lot of people who address abortion or homosexuality issues like these are anti-choice, homophobes, right-wing, zealous, incompetent bigots. And quite frankly, there's enough of those running around this country to give a profile to that type of caricature. Many people who have their own axes to grind against other people who have their own axes to grind. Hopefully one thing you find about me this evening is that by God's grace, I don't have an axe to grind. I want to share my perspective about the nature of biblical ethics on its own terms and why sexual politics is so important. The title of my forthcoming book is called First the Gospel and Politics. And it is my conviction that many Christians who deal with issues that I deal with end up making it first politics and then a little bit of gospel rationalization. My passion is no. The gospel, by definition, from the Greek euangelion, is to preach the good news. And yet, how many people think that we evangelicals preach good news, or do they think we preach condemnation? And so for anyone who says he or she is an evangelical, they just have to look at the words of Jesus when he says that the Son of Man came not to condemn, but to save. And so if I am truly faithful to the Bible in its own terms, then I will outline and define ethics that are positive on their own terms. Well, let me look at a biblical assumption of my worldview. If we are to understand, I wish I had a lavalier mic, because I would roam to the left and the right, but I have to lean here and be tight to the microphone. But let me give you an understanding of the Bible in its own terms. Now, this is a crucial phrase. When I did my postgraduate work, a THM in Ethics and Public Policy at Harvard Divinity School, one reason I did that was because a friend of mine did his PhD down there, and he said, John, you know, I think you are just the type of evangelical who would love studying at Harvard. And so I went down there and enjoyed it tremendously, because if you want to be a minority, being evangelical at Harvard Divinity School. This is part of the love of hard questions. And I was there with someone who had an assumption about the inspiration of Scripture, and that may be in a minority. And yet, by the same token, I could talk with those who didn't share my assumptions and yet come to a common ground in dealing with the Bible. And this is how I define the common ground. What is important is how the Bible understands itself. Because however we treat it, we must treat it on its own terms. And this is also true with human relationships. I'm not being an honest person if in responding to someone's question, interacting with a person, if I don't respect who they are as human beings, their own autobiography, their own background. In other words, I need to do my best to understand them as they understand themselves. That's always honesty, and particularly when it comes to people who share different backgrounds. And so if we're going to look at the Bible on its own terms, it's precisely that we need to understand what is it on its own terms. The entire Bible is defined by three doctrines that are introduced in Genesis chapters 1 through 3. Creation, sin, and redemption. Another way of speaking about that is the order of creation, the reversal of the order, which is sin, and the reversal of the reversal, which is redemption. Now, if you look at every religious origin text in human history, without exception, apart from the Bible, you have a classical and powerful distinction. Namely, the God of the Bible is the only God of any origin text who is presented as bigger than time, space, and number, bigger than the universe. In Greek thought, in dualistic thought, whether it's Hindu or Buddhist or whatever, or Mayan, the whole understanding is that gods and goddesses are smaller than the universe. They're subject to the universe. They are finite. They're petty. They're jealous. They beat up on each other, and they beat up on us. But the difference with the God of the Bible is in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And so you have an understanding of a God who is bigger than the universe. And so the entire Scripture is understood as God revealing himself in time, space, and number. And so he speaks the universe into being, and in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, he gives us the paradigm for worship of God and for human relationships. But powerfully, within this element, I'll come back to it shortly, is that we are not forced to accept God's love. You see, the very definition of God, the way the Bible views it, is his power is the power to give. Not to trample, not to destroy, not to take. In fact, in my thesis at Harvard Divinity School, the focus was on feminist ethics. And I was challenged by a number of feminists to read the two most competent feminist theologians which challenge the biblical worldview. Elizabeth Schuster-Fiorenza, who now teaches at Harvard, and Phyllis Tribble. And I read those theologians, I did my paper and my ultimate thesis on that. And one of the arguments by these feminists was that God of the Bible is a male chauvinist. They didn't quite use that exact language, but that was the intent. That it's a patriarchal God who likes to dehumanize women. Well, I'll circle back to that in just a moment, because this is the real issue. Is the order of creation good? Are men and women equal in the sight of God? And is that the view of the rest of the Bible? And of course, much of the argument today is no, the Bible is misogynist, which is, means that which hates women. So what you have in Genesis is you have Genesis 1 and 2 is the order of creation, Genesis 3 is the introduction of sin, and Genesis 3:15 to Revelation 22:21 is a contest between sin and redemption. Now, there are many ways in which we can look at the order of creation. One way we can look at it is topically. There are 4 subjects in the universe, and these 4 subjects are the following. And I want you to think very critically about this. I've been testing this out for about a decade to college audiences, to church audiences, to ask if there's a 5th all-defining subject or if there's less than 4. Here are the 4 subjects: God, life, choice, and sex. Now think about that for a moment. What other subjects are there that we ever deal with that are not one of those 4 subjects? How they are defined and how they relate to each other. God, life, choice, and sex. Let's look for a moment at the debate over human abortion. I did about 60 debates on this subject back in the 80s. And I remember one time speaking in New York before speaking at Cornell Northfield College and making some observations to myself about the debate. And I realized something. If you look at the debate over human abortion, you have 2 self-identifying camps. On the one hand, you have those who, in support of abortion rights, call themselves what? Pro-choice. On the other half of the equation, those who support the legal protection of the unborn call themselves what? Pro-life. Now, what's interesting is, I have done forums with Kate Mikeman, the head of the National Abortion Rights Action League, and Patricia Ireland, head of the National Organization for Women. And for a long time, I've gone out of my way to find the most concerted and convinced abortion rights supporters I can find. Whether to take them out to lunch with them occasionally, or to do public forums with them, or to meet them in other venues. And always trying to listen. And here's one question that I pose, which is central to our topic tonight. And I've said to some of these leaders, should sex be restricted to heterosexual, faithful, monogamous marriage? And I haven't found one abortion rights leader who will say yes to that. Now, many people who follow a pro-choice position may agree with that, but not among the leadership. And I've been fairly consistent in posing that question. And this is my observation. You've got choice on the one hand, you've got life on the other hand. And to me, the animating force behind the pro-choice position is a belief that sex outside of marriage is a valid expression. And what happens is, in many sexual liaisons outside of marriage, is you get an unintended pregnancy. And therefore, choice is employed to do what for many of those unintended pregnancies? To choose an abortion. When you choose an abortion, I argue you're destroying this sweet, biologically unique human life. We could talk about the moral or legal status later, but biologically, there's no doubt. And theologically, that's an affront against God. So all of a sudden, you get all four subjects: sex, choice, life, God. I'll argue that's in the reverse order of the order of creation. Now you take the pro-life position on the other hand. And apart from that, Henhoff of the Village Voice, I don't know of any current public pro-life advocates who do not believe in an orthodox conviction that God is the giver of life. And therefore, the animating force behind the pro-life movement, overwhelmingly, is a belief in God as a creator. So the definition of God drives the definition of life. Choice is seen in service to life, and therefore not to destroy life, unborn or aging, in terms of active euthanasia. And then sex is the most important choice we make. Now, these are the issues, and we see how we have God, life, choice, sex, or sex, choice, life, God, is the animating definitions in the debate over human abortion, and therefore choice and life come into conflict. And I argue that they should not come into conflict. And the order of creation is those four subjects. In the beginning, God, the sovereignty of God. Then the whole trajectory, Genesis 1 and 2, is the creation of lower forms of life, higher forms of life, then finally, man and woman, male and female, to rule over the works of his hands. The crown of God's creation, as it says in Psalm 8. And therefore, life is the goal of creation. That's why God made the universe, is for you and me to enjoy him, his goodness, and to enjoy forever. And then once life is made, the first words in human history are words of choice. And this is the sermon I was preaching yesterday in an assembly of 4 churches here at Northfield. And what's interesting about the language in Genesis 2:17 is it says, Yahweh God commanded the man, you are free to eat. And we see the word freedom. But in the Hebrew, it's far more robust than this. Yahweh God commanded the man, akol tokeo. That's 2 tenses of the verb to eat. I'm going to try a survey here. And if you didn't have to worry about your cholesterol or your weight, how many people here in this chapel tonight do not like to eat? You don't like to eat? The second person who said that in the last 2 years, among thousands. I'll talk to you afterward. How do you live? The metaphor for freedom in the Bible is akol tokeo, in feasting you shall feast. But you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, most talmud, in dying you will die, or you will surely die. Now, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is a Hebraicism for the knowledge of everything. And only God is big enough to know everything, including that which is bigger than time, space, and number. And only God can know evil and not be tempted by it. So essentially, what's being said here is a robust definition of freedom. God's giving to us an unlimited menu of good choices. Not only in food, but in moral decisions and in aesthetic choices, artistic, creative choices. But there's a caveat or a boundary. Don't eat poison. What good will freedom do us if we die? And so this is the message of Genesis. So it has a robust definition of freedom. In other words, an unlimited good choices. The whole universe is ours to explore and to enjoy so long as we don't pretend that we're smarter than God. That's the basic caveat, the basic prohibition. If you look at all the pagan texts in human history, the highest concept of freedom is freedom from suffering. You go back to the Babylonian Genesis or Buddhism, which is a subcategory of Hindu assumptions, you will find that the highest concept of freedom is an attempt to escape from slavery, attempt to escape violation. Why? They start with the assumption that violation is in place. They also start with the assumption that the war between the sexes is in place. Genesis starts with neither of those assumptions. It starts with the goodness of God, that male and female are equal morally, they are complementary. Women bear babies, men don't, and that's where a lot of the political debates around that very issue. And from my perspective as a man, do we as men respect women as our moral and social equals as they bear children? Or do we have chauvinistic definitions? The only way you have identity is what you contribute to the GDP. And I reject that from my male perspective. Men and women in the order of creation are made equal. And the pagan text assumed the brokenness is there to begin with. And so, God-like choices, unlimited menu of good choices, if we are faithful to God's order of creation. And then finally, is sex. God says it is not good for man to be alone. The only time that phrase is used in Genesis 1 and 2, not good. And the whole trajectory, which I go into depth in my forthcoming book, from the Bible's perspective, is that Adam is not the complete image bearer of God. He is not fully man in the sexually inclusive translation of that word in Hebrew. He is not man without woman. He is not fully the image bearer of God without his equal. In a minute, I'll try to define why that's the case in terms of the power to give. So these are the subjects of the order of creation: God, life, choice, and sex. And not only that, but to fast forward by a number of millennia, this is the very subject of the Declaration of Independence. And Thomas Jefferson is the one who wrote it in concert with others, but he's the one who penned the final language. And Thomas Jefferson is no evangelical. If you look at what he did in the New Testament, he took some scissors and cut out all the miracles because he didn't believe that miracles were possible. But he wasn't a deist. He wasn't one who believed that God didn't judge us. He was a rationalist who put his own human thinking ahead of the Scripture. But even though he wasn't an evangelical, he still was rooted in biblical ethics when it came to social policy. And as they were constructing the Declaration of Independence to say no to King George, and to say no to tyranny, and to say no to taxation without representation, he was looking for a definition of human rights that would be free from tyranny. And so he came up with these words that are perhaps the most famous words in American history. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. Now, if you look at the first part of that phrase, he says rights only begin if they're unalienable, and they come from the Creator. When I was doing a forum just about a year ago, last April, with Nadine Strawson, she's the president of the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, we were talking about homosexuality and civil rights. And Nadine, in her beginning comments, started with the observation of these unalienable rights. She quoted the very words I just quoted to you. So when it came time for our one-on-one interaction, I said, Nadine, you stole my thunder. I was going to quote those exact words, so thank you for doing that for me. So I just had to say that we agree on that point. But then I asked her a question. I said, Nadine, who is the Creator that Thomas Jefferson is referring to? And she hesitated for a moment, which is unlike Nadine Strawson. You've ever seen her on C-SPAN or various talk shows. She's quite a crackerjack, a very smart and gracious woman. And she hesitated for a moment, and she said, well, you have your Creator, and other people have their creators. Now, if you were to know my personality, I like to be low-key and understated. And when passion is evoked, I think there's a reason for passion to be evoked. And my soul, and I was much more low-key in my words, my soul went, no! But I said, no, Nadine. Polytheism is what she's talking about. One creator, other creators, is many creators. That's many gods. And my argument, and she has some challenges, nor other leaders I've submitted this to. My argument is that polytheism, without exception, in human history, only manifests itself in totalitarian governments. No concept for unalienable rights. The very concept that we love about rights that cannot be taken away from the government is what she is affirming, what I'm affirming. So I came back and I asked her. I said, no. I said no. I told you I said no. And then I said, who is the creator? And she looked at me and she said, well, why does it matter? So long as we have unalienable rights and we protect them. Well, to me, it matters tremendously. And I said, if we don't know where unalienable rights came from, we don't know where they've gone when we lose them. In other words, everything that we have, that we possess that is valuable today, has origins. There are roots to it. There's a history that came to the point, as Thomas Jefferson saying, we have unalienable rights given by our Creator. The Creator he was talking about was the God of the Bible, no one else. Then what were the rights he talked about? He summed up 3 rights. He summed up life. So Creator's God, life is life. He then said liberty, that's synonymous to choice. And then he said the pursuit of happiness. Well, some people think that that's synonymous with sex. And it's part of it. But the question is the definition and boundaries of sexuality. When you get to the 5th and 14th Amendments, the phrase is that no one shall be deprived without due process of life, liberty, or property. So what happens is the pursuit of happiness is a philosophical term, but property is a legal term. And why is this? You go back to Genesis, and it says, a man will leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. What's being said there is the establishment of a new household. That's why the man leaves his father and his mother in that biblical language. The Greek word for household or family is oikonomos. Does anyone know the English word that comes off of that? Economics. See, the whole concept of the ancient world was that the strength of the economy was based on household work, because most work was done in the household, in the villages and the towns. Very few people were employees. Most people were self-employed, and most people were working in villages with their various trades. And the understanding was if you want vibrant economic structure, you have healthy families, because that's where trust, hard work, mentoring, and apprenticeship is learned. And so, not only that, but once you have economic strength, you have property rights, the ability to earn property and to have your property be protected. And on that basis, you have the power to pursue happiness. Therefore, in terms of sexuality, in that context of the pursuit of happiness and property is based on the sexuality of faithful marriage, back to Genesis. So these are the subjects of God-like choice and sex, and it's my understanding that we define every issue that I've ever looked at. And so if someone can show me otherwise, I'll be delightful, or I would be delighted to learn, and I'll have to modify my paradigm accordingly. Now, another way of looking at Genesis, and I'll go a little bit beyond it, is I'll talk about 6 ethical components that sum up all of biblical faith. And these components I make myself accountable to. The first component is the power to give. I've already given a little prelude to this. That God the Father, and we use that language very explicitly, the Father, in terms of the fatherhood of God. We can circle back to what that language exactly means. But if you look at God the Father in Genesis, his power is eternal, it's unlimited, and the only way he employs his power in the order of creation, in other words, before sin comes in the world, is to give, to bless, and to benefit humankind, man and woman, made in his image. And again, if you look at all the pagan origin texts, the deities, the pagan deities that they start with, their power is the power to take and to destroy. So the word go on the assumption of Genesis is the power to give, and to give with no strings attached. When we come back to male and female in a few moments, I'll share why I think this is so important. The second ethical component, these first 4 are in the order of creation, and 2 sum up the nature of redemption. The second ethical component is the power to live in the light. And what I mean by that is the power to live openly, honestly, above board, no ulterior agendas, no secretiveness whatsoever. And the very nature of being a biblically faithful Christian is that we are honest. And many times I think one of the biggest stumbling blocks to the gospel is the fact that many Christians are less than honest. the less than above board. They have ulterior agendas. And so when I say that this is biblical ethics, I say I'm accountable to it. I'm accountable that my life is on the table, there's nothing hidden. I don't fear you knowing anything about my life, knowing every thought I've ever thought. I have no fear about that whatsoever. Because I know that, like you, apart from God's grace, I'm a sinner. But by God's grace, I'm a sinner saved by grace. And that very love of God shown to me enables me to be open and accountable to everyone. And I think if you got to know me, my wife, and my children, if you got to know my wife and my children, you would see 6 very strong-willed people. And my wife one time asked me, John, why are 4 children so strong-willed? And I said, well, look at who their parents are. My wife is very sweet, very hospitable, but and you don't think of her as strong-willed until you get to know her personally in terms of she knows what is right. She's like a mother bear when it comes to protecting what is right. I remember when her mother was at the hospital in Yukon. We've been taking care of her aged mother for some years. And she ran into a Pakistani doctor, and his cultural and religious background was such that he regarded women as dirt. And he simply would not talk to women. And my mother-in-law was falling through the cracks of the system, and her medical needs were not being attended to. And so my wife just kept getting in his face until finally she got justice, and she got what her mother needed. And what was very interesting was thereafter, we heard this Pakistani doctor saying, whatever Mrs. Rankin wants, you give it to her, and don't let me be involved in the process. But if you got to know me, my wife, and my children, you would see 6 strong personalities. You'd see the warps, you'd see the wrinkles, you'd see the fallacies, but you'd also see our commitment to honesty, our commitment to being transformed by God's truth, and our commitment to love our neighbors as ourselves. And I think you feel hospitably received, and I think you feel safe in our presence. And that to me is the power of living in the light which comes from the grace of God. The third ethical component, which I talked about a moment ago, is the power of informed choice. Namely, the very nature of God's power is, since He gives, to give a gift means you cannot force it. A gift given is a gift that can be received or a gift that can be rejected. And what's very powerful in Genesis 2 is God gives us the freedom to say yes or no to His love. Now, if someone doesn't theologically accept that that's what happened, but at least they can understand this is how the Bible regards itself. And if they understand that I hold myself accountable to those ethics, what does that say? The last thing I would ever do would be to seek to impose myself upon other people. The number one objection that I have seen in the gospel, in the culture, is don't shove it down my throat. Now, how many people have felt that at one level or another? That there are people out there, whether evangelical or otherwise. I know a lot of Christians who raise their hands to this, evangelical Christians. You see, I argue passionately that human nature is violated if someone seeks to impose their will upon us. And what is radical about the nature of the God of the Bible is He uniquely creates a level playing field. In fact, so level is that playing field, He invites the devil to have access to tempt. You look at the devil, historically and theologically, he doesn't want God to have equal access to show love. And see, this is the confidence of truth. You go to the pagan text, they don't want to give an opportunity for a different understanding, because all the pagan texts are rooted in totalitarian government, keeping the people underneath their authority, under their heels. And not so the God of the Bible. The power to give is the power for us to accept or to reject. And therefore, the entire presence of a biblically committed Christian, and this is completely true for biblically committed Jew, because everything I'm saying is Jewish. The difference between a Jew and a Christian, ultimately, is who is the Messiah. And if we disagree on who the Messiah is, we should still not disagree on the ethical components of what the Messiah is all about. It goes back to the same ethics in Genesis. And therefore, Genesis is unique in affirming the power of informed choice. And the fourth ethical component I derive from the order of creation is the power to love hard questions, which I gave a prelude to that already. Namely, the very nature of what it is to be an image bearer of God is we are not puppets and we're not animals. Genesis takes tremendous detail to explain that we're not puppets or animals. By being made in God's image, And by being given the freedom to say yes or no to that, unless we can say yes or no to it, we could not be creative. We could not enjoy the goodness of the creation that is in front of us. And therefore, there's this verse in Genesis 2:16. This is the RSSV. That's known as the Rankin Substandard Version, so don't quote this anywhere as the Texas Receptus. But Yahweh God commanded the man to go downhill skiing in whitewater canoe. I know that theologically. From the beginning, he gave us the entire planet to enjoy, relationships to enjoy. Now, of course, I guess downhill skiing is the biggest sport around here. I noticed that, well, we're on top of a mountain right here, aren't we? But perhaps not quite as large as I love in New England. But from the beginning, God knows that we're image bearers of God. We are creative. And he wants to win our informed choice, and part of that is his invitation for hard questions. If you look at Jesus' teaching style, which is classic rabbinic style, he asked far more questions than he told parables. Asked far more questions than he gave answers. And the reason is fairly simple. We are not interested in an answer to a question we have not posed. And therefore, God gives us the integrity to accept or reject and to pose the hard questions. So that's the order of creation. The power to give, the power to live in the light, the power to inform choice, the power to love hard questions. And the other two ethical components in the order of redemption are those which seek to restore those first four once sin comes in. And the definition of sin, by the way, is not what we do. That's a consequence of sin. We can do sinful acts. But sin is a word that means to miss the mark. It's an archery term. And I used to teach archery professionally. And what it means is you miss the bullseye. And I used to teach it at a summer camp. And of course, you have a 9-inch yellow bullseye. And if you're a good archer, you won't miss that once you learn how to do it. Of course, back at that time, they were putting sights on bows. It was almost like shooting a gun. It became boring at that point. I learned to do it without the sight. But then I would shoot at professional targets. And the professional targets are 1.5 inches, not 9 inches. And I would work real hard to be as good as I could. And I could get at my best, and this is my best, 43 out of 50 arrows in the bullseye. But those competing for the Olympics back in the early 70s would get 48 or 49 in the bullseye. And I was nowhere near their target, or nowhere near their average. But if you miss once, then the Greek archer would say, I sinned. I missed the perfection. Another definition of sin is brokenness in relationships, and this is the Hebrew definition. Once we sin, once we make our own decision apart from God, we have brokenness in relationships with God and from one another. And so, in restoring us to the order of creation in the face of sin, there are two ethical components, the fifth and sixth of the six I talk about, that are central to biblical issue. The fifth of the sixth, and therefore the first of redemptive ethics, is the power to love enemies. When Jesus was teaching the Sermon on the Mount, the apex, the highest moral point he made, he said, you've heard it said of old, you shall love your friends and hate your enemies. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. For any of us who have an identity as Christians, if we go to Romans 5, it says that when we were yet enemies of God through unbelief, God sent the Son to die for us. What that is saying is we were loved by God when we were enemies. As a Christian, I have no one on this planet who I regard as an enemy. Now, some people may regard me that way, but I don't regard them that way. The only enemy I have is the devil of hell and his demons. Why? Because God's love is meant to be given unrestrictedly to all of us who will receive it on his own terms. And therefore, the love of enemies means that I have the humility to know, apart from God's grace, I can be just as obnoxious as the most obnoxious people could be against me. And therefore, if I take this seriously, to love my enemies and to love those who think they're my enemies is a manifestation of God's very nature, the apex of the Sermon on the Mount. And finally is the power to forgive. And actually, I think the power to forgive is tougher than loving your enemies. Because your enemies are usually people you don't know on the other side of the social barricade. But forgiveness is usually people you do know who have hurt you. And that can be the toughest thing in the world to embrace sometimes. But the power to forgive equals the book in the Scriptures. The power to give, on the one hand, then in the face of sin, the power to forgive. And that's what God shows to us, and that's what we're to show to each other. So these are the six ethical components that sum up the order of creation, and therefore my worldview. Now, with that foundation in place, let's turn our attention to the issue of sexuality marriage, and some of the questions we've posed tonight in advertising this forum. The first observation we made is that male and female are made in the image of God. When I was studying at Harvard and these women came to me, I was sitting in the, I was doing a class in feminist ethics, and I was sitting in the cafeteria one day, and 3 of my fellow students came up to me, and there were, I think, 13 women in my class, another man, the teacher, and myself. And these 3 women walked up to me, and they said, you know, John, they introduced themselves, they said, you know, John, from evangelical, you're a nice guy. And they really thought that was an oxymoron, especially down at Harvard. And part of it had to do with the fact that I was in their midst as someone they knew, then headed up New England's largest evangelical pro-life group, and that I was comfortable with them. I wasn't being censorious or judgmental. They told me that they were each lesbian, and they made an observation. I want to be very careful as I quote this. This is anecdote, not statistics, but this is a powerful anecdote. This woman told me, she said, we're lesbian, and every lesbian we know has been physically, sexually, or emotionally abused by a man in her pre-adolescent years. Now, as I heard that, I thought to myself, because I really have not even dealt with the issue of homosexuality. I later learned, no, actually I learned before that my roommate, senior year in college, had died of AIDS in 1984, 83, one of the first people in the country. And I didn't know he was homosexual. And I lost a friend when he died. And my view of him was no more, no less. He was a friend who had died. But I had very little experience with homosexuality. So they shared this with me. And they said, well, you're a nice guy, and we know how you can be nicer yet. Now, how about that for an introduction? So I was interested to know how I could be nicer. And they said, read these 2 scholars, and you'll understand that the God of the Bible is a chauvinist. And once you get rid of your belief in the inspiration of the Old Testament, you will rise to a greater faith. I wasn't told what the greater faith was, but I was told assuredly I would rise. And I received that as one of the most wonderful challenges I've ever received, because I read those scholars and did my thesis on their work. And they pointed out that there are many instances in the Old Testament where men behave despicably toward women, and they are there. No question about it. There's also Jezebel killing 100 prophets, but I wasn't looking at it from that side of the equation, okay? And their observation was it's written by men, it's male chauvinist, and so forth. So what I did in a class where no one shared my evangelical assumptions, I presented the oral recitation of my paper. And I said, if we're going to look at these issues of so-called male chauvinism in the Bible, then we have to understand how the Bible reports them to us and why. How does the Bible understand itself? And so I said the Bible understands itself, the order of creation, sin, and redemption. No one challenged me. They agreed that was true. And I said, if you look at the order of creation, what you're going to find is that man and woman are made in God's image, and they're equal. Now, they agree with that in terms of Genesis 1:27, and God made them male and female. But they disagreed with it from Genesis chapter 2. The reason they did is they said, well, woman's made out of a man's rib, and she's made as an afterthought. And we think that's fairly chauvinistic. That was their argument. Well, actually, in Hebrew, out of the rib is the substance of his substance, and it's a morally equal statement. But I pointed out that no, woman's not an afterthought. If you look all the way through Genesis, God saves the best for last, which is to say that man is not complete without woman being made. Man is the crown of his creation, and man is not complete until man. In the Hebrew, Adam, where Adam gets his name, means both male and female. So Adam takes on the name male and female. But Adam can't have a name until female is there, male and female. And the other clip I'd like to throw out here is when they say that a woman's made from Adam's flesh, and that's kind of denigrating. I say, well, you got one of 2 choices. You can be made from human flesh, or be made from a pile of dirt. What is your choice? The man is made from a pile of dirt, if you go back to Genesis 2:7. The difference is, God breathes his spirit into us. But there's a far deeper reality that's involved here. And I was sharing this with Patricia Ireland at Smith College several years ago. I said you've got one of 3 choices in marriage: 100-0, 50-50, or 100-100. The 100-0 option is male chauvinism, or conceivably a female chauvinism in terms of the Jezebel. But for the most part, socially, a male chauvinism where the man demands 100% and gives nothing. And I reject that biblically from the Word of God. The second option is 50-50. This is the 1970s egalitarian view toward marriage, that men and women basically can do the same thing, other than giving birth to babies. And therefore, the ideal egalitarian marriage was the man and the woman both earn half the income, pay half the mortgage, do half the child raising, half the diapers, half the cooking, and half the dishes. But what happened in a lot of these egalitarian marriages, and sociological studies have shown this, is the woman's workload went up 80% and the man's stayed the same and went down a little bit. He wouldn't do the dishes, he wouldn't change the diapers, is what it came down to when she was out in a professional arena earning money. But at the deeper level, the 50-50 equation is I will take my 50 and you take your 50. But what happens if someone takes 50-20? You have war. You see, the 100-0 is a take before you take it, and the 50-50 is a take before you take it. So the third option is 100-100. You give 100, you receive 100, you give 100 back. Now, where do you get the source for the initiative of giving? All the pagan texts start with petty, finite, jealous gods who take and don't give. Only Genesis, and therefore the fatherhood of God, is the power to give. When you give, you have to receive before you can give to someone else. We can't give life until first we receive life. And if you look at your upbringing and friends and whatnot, when people give you love, you are strengthened. And you're strengthened to give other people love. But when people give you hate, you are demeaned, and you become nasty to other people. I see this in social equations in the family and outward all over the place. And it takes a lot of energy when someone has been disrespectful to us not to be hurt by that and to turn around and be gracious to others. So one of two choices, give it shall be given or take before you take it. The whole paradigm of male and female in Genesis chapter 1 and 2 is God gives 100% to Adam. Adam receives it, but he's not complete until he gives 100% to his wife. And she receives and gives it back. Now there's no hierarchy here in terms of being greater than, because the only definition of power in God's nature and human nature is the power to give. So for example, in the paradigm for Christian marriage in Ephesians 5:21, it says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Then 3 verses, wives to your husbands. Then 7 verses, husbands to your wives. And husbands, as Christ died for the church, you love your wives. Well, the verb there, hypostasso in the Greek, means to place yourself under. And to place yourself under can have one of two perspectives. If you or I have got experience of people who dominate us, or trample us, or dehumanize us, do we want to place ourselves under them in a vulnerable position? No way. And what happens, a lot of people have been violent, and unfortunately in the name of the church, very often. And the very idea of submission is the idea of being dominated and trampled. But that's not the biblical concept. Let me take another survey here. How many people here do not like a good background? I love it. Another naysayer, okay. To get a good background, you have to literally place yourself under the person giving you the background. You see, you cannot place yourself under someone you do not trust. But someone you do trust, you gladly place yourself under because you are blessed. A background, to me, is an absolutely wonderful thing. And my wife and I have a system of giving each other simultaneous backgrounds as complete, knees on top of each other and full body weight backgrounds. And that's one of the joys of life and one of the joys of marriage. And so, it's the power to give. It's the power to give. And so the very model that God has for male and female from the beginning is give and it shall be given. And it's unique in human history's recordings and religious origin texts that is the nature of God himself. Now, this comes to the nature of marriage itself. Is the purpose of marriage procreation? No. That's the fruit of marriage. In other words, if you look at God-like choice in sex, the most important choice we ever make is who we marry. Because when we marry someone, and the Hebrew definition of marriage, by the way, is when a man sleeps with a woman. That's what marriage is. That's why if a man were to sleep with a virgin in the Old Testament, he was obligated to marry her, to be responsible to her. And so the biblical concept of marriage, we understand that when we're married and the two become one, that is the essence. And if you look at Trinitarian theology and biblical perspective, the three who are one, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, who honor each other and give to each other, the three who are one. You have unity and diversity in that very equation. And marriage becomes a mimic of that. The two who are one, we are to give to each other. Therefore, the very nature of marriage is the power to give, the power to receive what is given, so we can give back. We either catalyze the power of giving, and it goes on endlessly and wonderfully, or we catalyze the power of taking, and it destroys all in its path. And so, the most important choice we have is who we marry, because when we marry, we have the power to pass on to our children, through procreation, the gifts of life, choice, and sex that God has given us to begin with. And so on that basis, the purpose of marriage is not sex, it's not children. The purpose of marriage is giving and receiving, and sexual intimacy is the highest and the most holy expression of giving and receiving. God's been very gracious to me, a baby boom child through the 60s and so forth, and very gracious to my wife, in that we survived our teen years as virgins, and that was God's tremendous grace. When we got married on August 6, 1977, we realized a year later we got married on the anniversary of Hiroshima, but our marriage was much more productive than that. But anyhow, when we got married, and when we embraced each other sexually for the first time in the marriage bed, we looked at each other and we said, this is holy, this is beautiful. One thing I respected profoundly as a man was what it is for a woman to open herself up to a man, emotionally, physically, sexually, and spiritually, and what it is to be one. Talking to my wife last night, and we were just talking about some stuff, and a phrase that's common between us is, John, you're my best friend. Well, Nancy, you're my best friend. You're my soulmate. You're my lover. Our lives are one. And I'll tell you something. The sexual experience itself, if atomized, has certain physical pleasure to it. There's no question about that whatsoever. But if you divorce that from a commitment to be one for a lifetime, pain multiplies over and over and over again. But if by God's grace, it's only by God's grace, because the reason we came into marriage as virgins is not because we're more righteous or special or whatnot, but it's God's grace, His unmerited favor. I thank Him for that. I thank Him for that very deeply. I guard it jealously. But you see, that is what the order of creation is all about, is two becoming one in the sharing and the building of an entire life around it. And then when you have children, what a remarkable, challenging, exhausting, and delightful adventure it is. They grow so fast, and I can't believe it. My youngest son now surpasses 6 feet. So my oldest son is the shortest of my sons. 19, 17, and 12, and my 12-year-old is now 6 foot. And the 17-year-old is 6 foot 2. And the 19-year-old is 5'11". But it just, and my 7-year-old daughter, I don't think will surpass them. But anyhow, it's all my wife's fault. Her brother's 6'5". Anyhow, so, but you look at children, and you see their personalities, and you see how they reflect mom and dad and grandparents and so forth. And the creative, nurturing task of building into them the joys of their lives. There's nothing more satisfactory in my life. So, having children is not the purpose for sex, and sex is not the depth of what marriage is. Rather, marriage is consummated in sex, based on the deeper ethics of the power to give. And once it's consummated in sexual intimacy and intercourse, then we have the possibility and hopefully the joy of having children. Now let me talk, as I bring some of my thoughts to a close and we open up for the Q&A, let me talk about homosexuality and civil rights in a pluralistic society, and look at some of the questions we posed and some of the tough issues that surround the question of homosexuality. We talked about, the one question we threw out tonight in the advertisement was, is human abortion the ultimate male chauvinism, or the ultimate essence, or the essence of feminism? When I was doing this forum at Smith College with Patricia Ireland, and if you know anything about Smith College in Northampton, Mass., it's the most philosophically feminist college in the country. And to be a white, heterosexual, male, evangelical, pro-life minister, there were 6 strikes against me before I stood up. And so I was hosting Patricia Ireland, we were having a tremendous interchange. We've done 2 forums in the meantime. And one of the questions she had for me was a question about Operation Rescue. She knew that I headed up New England's largest evangelical pro-life ministry for years. My answer was quick and straight to the point. And I told him in 1989, I met with Randall Terry, the head of Operation Rescue, and I posed him to his face. And I said the ethic of vigilante action, taking the law into your own hands to force your view of righteousness on someone else is the opposite of God's nature. We are to win by persuasion. The book goes into this in detail. And I asked him 3 theological questions, and for 9 years he refused to communicate with me. And the reason, despite faxes and certified letters and everything, and the reason being is that he had a wrong view of Christianity. And I didn't say this publicly for years, because I wanted to give him an opportunity to be accountable to the questions I asked, to prove me wrong, or to be accountable to my understanding of the Bible. And so I shared that with her. And I think that gave her a sense of trust in me when she saw my passion and the history of my passion. But in the context of that discussion, I argued that abortion was the ultimate male chauvinism. And the reason I argued that is that if you look at all abortion decisions today, 82% of them are out of wedlock. And if you look at sociological profiles of why women get abortions, depending on how you define it, between 60 and 85% of women will tell you the reason they're getting the abortion is the thought the child will not be responsible with her to raise the child. Now, there are many other complicating motivations, but that is, in most cases, a major motivation, and in most of the rest of the cases, it is an actual element of reality. And so, to me, the whole Planned Parenthood mentality is one of, or excuse me, the whole Playboy mentality is one of male chauvinism. What does Playboy and Hustler and what's the other magazine, Penthouse, and other pornography do about women? They view women as objects to reify them. They don't treat them as moral equals. And the Playboy mentality, if you treat a woman as an object, if you have sex with her and get her pregnant, and she becomes pregnant, she's viewed as a broken toy that has to be sent off to the factory to be fixed, so you can bring her back and play with her again. This is the Playboy chauvinistic mentality that I argue drives the overwhelming element of the abortion industry today and the abortion mindset. Now, I made this argument with about 500 feminists, and what blew my mind at the end of the evening was the last question I got was a woman who said, well, Mr. Rankin, you speak about showing respect and dignity to women, but how can you do that if you wish to argue against legalized abortion? And I had about 15 seconds to answer. And I said, just as much as I'm convinced that abortion destroys the unborn, so too I'm convinced that it rips women off and submits them to the violence of male chauvinism. And I was blown away because at the beginning of the third clause, I was interrupted by enthusiastic, long, sustained applause. Now, why was that? Again, I'm politically incorrect as it can be, okay, in my position as a pro-life advocate. What I think happened, what was demonstrated to me, is a lot of the women there knew the reality of the men who viewed them ultimately as sexual objects. Because if they view them as more than sexual objects, they will marry them, give their entire person to them, and honor and protect them for their whole lives, and will be nurturing their children that are conceived. So my argument is abortion is the ultimate male chauvinism, and therefore it should not be a linchpin of feminism. It should be the rally cry against abortion. It should be that which feminists protest. The other question we talked about, what were the 2 questions? We had the question on marriage as a civil right. I'll talk about this for a moment. My argument, I have a referendum I'm preparing for Maine and Colorado, and it deals with human sexuality and civil rights. And it makes a couple of observations. Number 1, that all of us, period, no matter what our identities are, heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, black, white, whatever religion may happen to be, all of us deserve protection of our unalienable rights, period. The next thing that I argue is that faithful marriage, the historic family unit, is the social glue of society, and it needs legal protection. An assumption in that is that marriage is not a civil right. Marriage is a responsibility. There's nothing in constitutional language about civil rights that says that marriage is a right. In fact, marriage is a responsibility, and we are accountable to it when we get married. Then I go through the rest of this resolution, and I point out that there are many people, due to reasons of choice, circumstance, the brokenness of adversity, who are not in the historic family unit, who do not believe they can be in it. And I haven't identified anyone sexually. I just said there are those who, for various reasons, cannot identify. And on that basis, I say that marriage should be protected, but those who have private associations outside of marriage should not be prosecuted. I'm against anti-sodomy laws. I'm against any sexual police tracing down what people do in their private lives. Period and passionately. And I argue this from the Bible. Those who try to argue for a sexual police are those who misinterpret biblical theocracy and apply it wrongly and out of context. But the third point I come to in this resolution is that all people, all of us, without exception, are accountable for the public consequences of our private choices. And on that basis, there are laws to protect against adultery. I will argue that there should be laws against pornography, against rape, pederasty, pedophilia, and prostitution. I would also argue laws against those things. Because they all, in one form or another, deny the life, the liberty, and the property of other people. And on that basis, we are saying that marriage is positive, yes and amen, the foundation of society. It's a privilege, not a civil right, and that's why I say no to homosexual marriages. But I don't say no to the freedom of private association. What I say, if there are consequences, public consequences, for private associations and relationships, we should be accountable for those choices. One time I was doing a forum with a man who claims to be the longest standing homosexual in the United States, a man named Harry Freeman Jones in Syracuse, New York. And most of the audience that evening was a small audience in a coffee house type of place, was very unevangelical in their assumptions. And I leaned over at one point and I said, let me tell you the public consequences of my sexuality. And I told them, Chad, Stuart, Jeremy, and Brittany. And I don't want the government to pay for the public consequences of my private sexuality. And I think the same is true for homosexuals or heterosexuals out of marriage as well. So on that basis, I will argue passionately for civil rights based not on our sexual preference or even based on our religious preference, but based on our humanity. On this basis, I don't want my civil rights affirmed because I'm a Christian. I want my right to be a Christian, so long as I don't deprive others of life, liberty, and property. And that's the basis of civil rights. And I was doing a forum in California last year, and a lesbian attorney spoke up at the end, identified herself as such, and she was known to some of the people there. And she tried very hard to get me to make a homophobic statement. And I didn't do it, because that's not in my soul by the grace of God. And I looked at her, she wants to sit down. And I said, I want to tell you something, and this is honest. That if I were in a situation where your life was in imminent danger, and I was in a position to risk my life to save it, I would do it in one. And the reason I would do it is because that's what Jesus Christ has done for me. That is the value I give to you as a human being. This is the love of enemies in theological language, but I don't regard her as an enemy. I regard her as someone for whom Christ died, made equally in the image of God. What was our third question, Katie? Oh, we dealt with that. Okay, is the God of the Bible male chauvinist or feminist? I didn't answer it. Neither. Okay. My observation is that the best understanding of the equality of male and female is based on the power to give. So let me circle on that thought and bring my thoughts to a conclusion. But before I do, I want to make a couple of practical announcements before we begin the Q&A process. On the table on your way out tonight, there are brochures on the Theological Education Institute, the private school I founded some years ago. My eventual goal is to build it into an undergraduate university. Right now, it has a faculty of 3, me, myself, and I, so wherever I am, the TEI is. And it tells you about the TEI, but especially, is anyone here who's interested in ordering my forthcoming book? I'll be announcing the publication date in about a month. It's called First the Gospel in Politics. Let me tell you a little bit about what the book is in case you want to order it, because I'm going to give a big discount for college students. It's almost 1,000 pages long. And the reason is that it's unacademic, or at least it tries to be. The language tries to be very simple and straightforward. But I spent half the book laying out positive elements in Genesis, some of which I talked about tonight, patiently and thoroughly. The chapter on human sexuality in the manuscript itself is 109 pages, about 135 in the hardback when it gets to that point. Dealing with the toughest questions that I have dealt with over the last 15 years of public policy ministry. I do it Theologically, I lay all the positives of Genesis. Once that's done, then I look at some of the political disputes in the culture today. Creation, evolution, homosexuality, abortion, prayer in public schools, and issues like that. Well, anyhow, if you're interested in ordering that book, okay, it will be retailing for $44. It's an investment, acid-free paper, a huge book. If he wants to order that as a student, you can do so for $30. You can either include that in the envelope and give it to Katie tonight, or if you don't have the money now and want to order it later, what you do is fill out the card and make sure to put your summer address as well as your campus address, because it'll probably be mailed in June or July. And if you want to simply take that advantage of that order, I will put you in the computer and send you a note when it's ready. You can send the money in the meantime, or you can buy it then. And so I just want to make that available for college students. So that is be available on your way out. As of this point, what we'd like to do is I've spent about 63 minutes, so I've been long-winded. So we're going to spend about another hour. I'm glad to stay beyond that for anyone who wants to, for questions and answers. Now, as we advertise, the questions I want to especially first are people who disagree with my assumptions or would challenge any of my interpretations or positions whatsoever. We have 3 microphones to my left, my center, and my right, and so please walk up to them. And one gentleman as quick as can be, so I'm going to start over here, and I'll continue to go back and forth, and we'll take your questions. I'll also ask you, as we do this, to be as concise and brief as you can. By the same token, many of your questions will need a little background information, so you may have to do that. Also, if any of your questions want to have a follow-through question that follows thereafter, I'm glad to do that. But especially I want you to be concise and focused on the question as reasonably as you can. And as you ask your questions, please give me your first name.
My name is Brian.
What is it?
Is it on? Okay. My name is Brian.
Hi, Brian.
And thanks for speaking to us today. I was wondering about one issue that you touched upon, gay marriage as a civil right or liberty. But theoretically and philosophically, we can talk about that, but I'd like to apply it to our policy in our country, because it's one thing to say I am not in favor of sex police, but I don't support marriage as a civil right. But we still have laws and policies that deal with this. And one that I would like to address you with a hypothetical situation would involve, let's just say, for example, 2 gay men that are married for 49 years, and one of them will say John and Michael, and John is diagnosed with liver cancer and is in the hospital. And I think I can see by your expression that you know it's coming. And in our country, we have a problem with health insurance and partnership laws. So even if you're not in favor of marriage as a civil right, what about situations where they need health insurance and they've been married just as heterosexual couples have been for 49 years, but when it comes to a crisis, a medical crisis, and the partner is the one that has health insurance and a job, who is healthy, what would you propose to do in that situation?
And then another element to that question is hospital visitation rights, which in some jurisdictions is an issue as well. Well, my answer is far more radical than you might imagine, and that is, as a PK, physician's kid, I'm completely at odds with the entire health insurance industry in this country today. And one reason for that is that if you go back, in one chapter in my book I forgot to mention, is a radical alternative to health insurance that is based not on legal contract, but based on moral contract. The various groups in the country doing this effectively, but within narrow Christian context. I'm extending it way out. And if the model works, the way my research is convinced it will work, it can reduce health insurance by 30 to 60%, depending on the variables of who you are. But if you go back to the founding of this country, 95% were self-employed and 5% were employed. It's almost completely reversed at this point. And you go back to the 1940s when, in order to get around certain union wage laws, health insurance became something added to wages in order to raise the wages above certain artificial caps. And so that's become completely assumed at this point. And so my alternative health insurance is something that is truly portable from person to person. But that's not answering the exact question for those in the situation. I just wanted to give you a flavor of my deeper convictions. Other issues you have to address at this point is spousal health insurance. The reason you have spousal rights in historic employment contract is to give the freedom to the woman, and freedom, not requirement, the freedom for the woman to be at home full-time and raising children, especially when the children are young. Now, if you take a marriage based on that arrangement, honestly, you are saying the money earned by the husband is not the husband's, it is the husband's and the wife's equally. And her work and her contribution to raising the children and governing the household is worth just as much because the two work together in a mutual submission. And so the reason you have spousal benefits is because of people who choose not to be in the workforce. Now, when you're dealing with homosexual relationships, prior to the issue of adopting children, well, let's say there are no children, okay? Because intrinsically, homosexuals cannot have children if that's the only sexual relationships they have. And so there are no children, and therefore you have the ability for both to work and both to have their own health insurance. And so in that case, it would not be an applicable issue. But if you get the case of many homosexuals, particularly lesbians, I know a number, who through individual fertilization or adoption will bring in a child, and one party will stay at home more full-time to raise, and they need to argue at that point that they are that they deserve those rights and so forth. What I would say at this point is the employer is free to do that for the couples if they want to, but there should be no federal law that requires that whatsoever. I am very much opposed to expanded federal government and coming into the deep personal issues of our lives. And some people say, well, why do I oppose abortion? Well, abortion isn't a personal issue. It is a denial of life, liberty, and property to another life, and that's the criteria by which I judge it. And this is a classical debate between Calvin and Hobbes. Now, I'm not talking about the comic strip, but John Calvin, Swiss theologian, and Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes argues that we are also irascible and untrustworthy, you need a top-down, Leviathan monster government. But Calvin argues before Hobbes was alive that the only way you have social glue is if you have trust. And trust is taught quintessentially between husband and wife and what they model for their children. And once trust is taught in the family unit, it moves on outward. And so on that basis, I'm in favor of anything entrepreneurial, anything self-employed, anything that is local as possible. Now let's go back to the situation of a homosexual couple and they adopt or have an in vitro child. And what are their civil rights at that point? Well, I would say that's a choice that they will go into ahead of time. I'm going to argue also that we need male and female when we grow up. So many of the social problems I talked about earlier in terms of fatherlessness are based on not having the role of male and female. So I'd argue against the social health of, say, a homosexual couple with children at this point, but I would not argue against their civil rights to procure health insurance on the terms that they provided or on the terms they require their employers to do. The only point of disagreement I would have at this point is I don't think wages or health insurance are a civil right. What I believe are civil rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the pursuit of happiness is our economic freedom to determine our own destinies. It's also the freedom to fail. And the greatest success is based on the freedom to fail as well. And I would apply those laws universally as well. In terms of the married couple, I would say the same thing.
And what about visitation rights?
Can you speak up a little bit?
And what about visitation rights?
Okay. At that point, you're dealing not again with federal government, but local hospital policy. You may be, well, sometimes you may have local ordinances, okay? Then you might get into governmental issue. But I remember when my younger brother was born, and he was a surprise. My dad was 48, mom was 43. And I asked my mom 10 years before that if I could have a brother. I had 3 sisters. I was 6 years old, I was very young, and I didn't know what equivocation was, but my mother equivocated when I asked her for a brother. So years later, much less surprised, he came along, and I was 12 and a half when he was born, and I remember they didn't allow anyone under the age of 12 to come to the hospital. We couldn't touch our baby brother, we had to look through the window and so forth. A lot of those things are loosened up. And so I would argue that you need to have the complete social freedom as a person in the hospital to have any visit you want. So far broader than that issue, but it would be inclusive of that. So what I'm saying is I am disagreeing theologically and in terms of the social order of protecting marriage with homosexual marriage, okay? But I am saying that homosexuals are equal human beings. I live in the same way. They have the same civil rights on a proper definition of civil rights. Thank you. Yes, sir.
My name is Sean.
Sean?
Yeah, and I'm a double PK. Both my parents are pastors, not physicians.
Oh, okay.
But
Oh, you say pastor and a physician?
They're both pastors, not
Okay.
physicians. But I was wondering, I have a Jewish aunt, and my cousin's boyfriend is Muslim. You know, what is your view of other religions? You talked about pagan texts describing gods as being jealous, and in the Old Testament there is some of that language. And what is your opinion of other religions? Are Christians the only ones who are saved?
Right.
Things like that.
Very good question. First of all, in terms of jealous, there's different words translated as jealous. And what Yahweh says in the Old Testament is he is jealous for the love of the Jewish people and to protect them. But his jealousy is based on informed choice, not based on manipulation. When I said petty and jealous, petty was modifying that type of jealousy that I was talking about in terms of the pagan gods. When we talk about pagan, we're talking ultimately about non-biblical, non-Jewish, non-Christian. You mentioned Islam, I'll come to that in just a second. So what I was talking about in that context was Babylonian religion, Hindu religion, Mayan religion, Celtic religion, the assumptions that come out of the background that do not believe in the eternal God who's bigger than the universe. So that's what I mean by pagan. And there are many people who are self-described pagans in culture today. And they do so in a very positive term. So I don't use it as a negative or pejorative. But though it actually comes from the Latin word paganus, which means of the hills. And it meant those in the hill country who had not yet heard the gospel as it came into Europe. I guess we could call it hillbillies if we wanted to. The other word, heathen, means those who live in the heathers, those who live in the lowlands and not in the cities. So it was descriptive of people who had not yet heard the gospel, and that's where the word comes from. So to me, I use it in the classic sense of those who are outside of a biblical framework. So that means anyone who's not Jewish or Christian. Now let's jump into the issue of Islam. Islam properly is a heresy of Christianity. I use a very strong word for a sect that veered away from Christianity. Muhammad ran into some tritheists who had been excommunicated from southern Turkey in the late 6th century. And they talked about God the Father, God the Son, God the Mother, and God the Son. And he didn't see a trinity of one God. He saw three deities. So he reacted, as best I recall. In fact, I'm reading the Quran right now. I was doing some plane flying out there. And he reacted to a polytheism with there's one God alone, Allah is his name. There's a certain etymological history to Allah, I'm told it goes back to ancient pagan sun god. But apart from that, he claimed to be an inheritor of the biblical tradition to fulfill what Christianity had failed at fulfilling. So in that sense, Islam makes itself accountable to the biblical worldview. The same is true with the Mormon religion. The Mormon religion believes that it is the Latter-day Saints that fulfills what Christianity failed, and it traces itself also back to the God of the Bible and back to Adam and Eve. So when I talk with Muslims and Mormons, in fact I talk with a lot of Mormons in various trips to Salt Lake City, I always talk about the ethics that I share with you tonight in Genesis chapters 1 through 3. And we build up a tremendous ability to then look at our differences, but while having mutual respect in the midst. You asked a final question about salvation. What is very clear in my conviction and in terms of biblical history is the only God who has the power to save is the God of the Bible. If you look at, for example, the definition of salvation in Hinduism or Buddhism, their definition is escape from suffering. It is reincarnation to a cycle when you lose individuality and you also lose suffering. It's not the biblical definition of an individual who exists forever. Now, certain pagan religions do have a view of the afterlife as well. But my conviction is this, and I developed this very thoroughly in my book, is you have the only claims to truth in terms of ethical power. Only Genesis has a positive view of God's nature, human freedom, love of heart questions, science, law, are the issues like these. And that's what ethically draws me to Genesis. And God gives us freedom to move away, and that's who the pagan nations become. He says salvation is only through him, and Jesus Christ is the one who fulfills the God of the Old Testament. And so I believe salvation is only found through Jesus Christ. But there's another element that's very powerful. And you can see this in various parts in the Bible, and I point this out, whether dealing with the book of Jonah, the book of Daniel, or looking at Romans 2. What about those who have not heard the preaching of the gospel? Those who don't know the name of Jesus Christ, who didn't know the covenant name of Yahweh for the Jews? What Romans 2 says is those people will be judged according to the secrets in their hearts by who Jesus Christ is. Which is to say, it's only Jesus Christ who has the power to save them. and in their ignorance. Nowhere in Scripture are we ever judged for what we're ignorant of. We're only judged for things we knew and we went against. And it says in Romans 1 that all people know by the order of creation is of God who judges who's righteous and who's true. So, to sum it up, there's a lot of territory around this. Salvation is only through Jesus Christ. I argue the only basis for truth and beauty goes back to Genesis, which Jesus fulfills. But he is able to extend that to those who haven't heard the truth according to their response to the order of creation.
Well, how about, I guess, condemnation as opposed to salvation? I mean,
Okay.
are people who are pagan sort of condemned?
Well, what the Scripture says is all condemnation is self-imposed. Walking through the language. And Jesus said the Son of Man came not to condemn, but to save. In other words, he came into a world where condemnation was all over the place. And he came to say, look, you can be free from condemnation. The devil is known as the accuser. And the devil gets us to accuse and condemn one another. And this is the liberty, what the gospel is all about, is that we have forgiveness for our sins. And we have freedom from condemnation. And that's why it's my passion that no Christian whatsoever should be condemning or judgmental over and against someone else. We are to judge between truth and falsehood in terms of making choices in our lives. That's a question of discernment, but we are not to pass sentence on someone else. And that's why I'm not saved according to my theology, because I can tell you it's not perfect. I'm a human being. I'm saved according to the grace of Jesus Christ. And if I realize my fallibility, despite how hard I seek to study and understand the Scriptures, then I will always be humble in the face of others. And one of the most important elements that I'm interested in the proclamation of the gospel in this context is social policy and civil rights, is what this says of those who claim to be biblical, Jewish or Christian, is our attitude toward all other people should be politic at all times. And that should be the definitive hermeneutic or method of interpretation of public policy. Thank you. Let's take a topic over here. The one who doesn't like to eat.
Oh, yeah. Anyway, I'm Shane. I'm Sean.
Okay. And you said Shane?
Yes, Shane. It's really funny when you describe that to other people.
Okay.
Okay, you describe marriage as something where people can give and receive, and it's a very positive bonding experience.
Yes.
I'm wondering how you differentiate between a heterosexual marriage being something positive that the public should support, while a homosexual marriage is something you describe as kind of in the private life of society.
Well, okay. The first thing I'm going to say is the following. And I didn't go into detail on this, so thank you for raising the question. And that is that male and female are complementary. Not only is that true physically, but it's true emotionally in terms of our brain. As Carol Gilligan published in Harvard in 1981 in A Different Voice, she challenged Kohlberg's whole psychological theory of judging human nature based on studies of boys. She said you can't judge girls based on studies of boys. And this was actually a sea change in feminism, from egalitarianism to realizing, as subsequent studies showed, that we have the right half side of the brain and the left half side of the brain. The right brain is very relationship-oriented, and the left brain is very task-oriented. Now, about 6 months in utero, in the womb, there's a hormone that is washing over the brain, that stops washing over the male brain, and continues to wash over the female brain. What happens is there are more synapses between the female's left half side and right half side, and there are fewer for the man's. What this translates into in terms of thinking process is the man can put relational concerns on the shelf and be very task-oriented, where the woman in her task orientation is always thinking relationships at the same time. Now this isn't hard and fast in all cases. There are different emphases between men and women, but you'll find this to be a reality between man and woman. And quite frankly, woman is more holistic in her intellect at this point. Namely, she's not only looking at the task, she's looking at the relationships. And the way I like to quip about this, they like to talk about this theoretical 625-mile trip from Pittsburgh to Boston in 1977 with my pregnant wife. And we're looking at the trip, and I'm saying 625 miles an hour, X miles an hour, a 15-minute stop in Port Jarvis, New York for food and fuel, and we'll get to Boston in a certain amount of time. My wife is thinking, well, what restaurants are there in Poconos? And what hotels can we stay at? I'm focusing at getting there. She's focusing on how we get there in the process. Well, here's my argument. My argument is that you can give and can receive outside of marriage. There's no question about that. But you can't have the full model of giving and receiving that's possible between a man's emotions and a woman's emotions, a man's intellect, a woman's intellect, and also, quintessentially, It is a man in sexual intercourse who can fertilize a woman and she can bear a child at that point. So, I will not take away any element whatsoever from elements of giving and receiving. They are there. And quite frankly, you can see some homosexual unions that are far healthier than a lot of heterosexual marriages. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. But I'm going to argue that the biblical model of heterosexual marriage is the only one that has full health. And so whether we are in a marriage that does not treat man and woman as moral equals, and does not mutually submit, mutually give, will have the same problems that many other relationships will have. So yes, giving can happen, but not in the fullest sense of the order of creation.
So your two-part answer is, the first part is that a relationship with two men and two women is not functional enough that we should support it. And the second half is that because there's intrinsically not the ability to form life there, that's another reason that a homosexual marriage should be supported. So how do you feel about couples who are childless by choice?
Well, I think they're losing something very powerfully. When Genesis says, fill the earth and subdue it, and when it's repeated after Noah's flood, fill the earth and subdue it, it is saying at that point that what the quintessence, in many ways, of the marriage relationship is having children. But those who don't, okay, you were very specific, those by choice, because there are those who can't have children and it's beyond their choice. And that's part of sin in its passive realities, and over certain genetic things. And there could be things of choice that can hurt someone's childbearing capacity. But those who choose not to have it by choice, I think they're really losing something. Because in the order of creation, with no death, no divorce, no brokenness, no distrust, and no pain, searing pain in childbirth as well, then there's absolute joy and prosperity in having children. And a lot of us can't have many elements of the order of creation beyond our reach, various things are beyond our control. But I believe that the promises of the order of creation, to which God restores us, need to be modeled as best as we possibly can. Well, thank you. And let's go to this gentleman over here. Or no, I'm sorry, the lady. It's my bifocal. And your name?
It's Maud.
What is that?
Maud.
How do you spell that?
M-A-U-D.
Oh, Maud. Okay. I mean, you hear it. Please continue.
Okay, so you said that most of the young men who were in jails were
Could you speak to the mic a little bit closer?
Sorry, you said that most of the men who were in jails were men who had been fatherless. Have you checked these figures, like in other countries that are culturally different, that might have stronger community ties, versus to a country like the U.S. where it's all completely nuclear, family-oriented?
You know, I have not. This was a study I read in some journal about 5 years ago. In fact, it was publicized. There were some TV shows on it as well, and many editorials about it. And so the question being asked is, have I compared this with other countries? Oh, I am sure that in many cultures where the family is still intact, you have nowhere near that reality. In fact, in Islamic countries. But of course, I wouldn't want to live in an Islamic country where you have clitorectomy, the cutting off of a woman's sexual feelings in order to deny her sexual pleasure. There's many things in those legal structures that I want to say I would not endorse. And quite frankly, you can make an idol out of anything. People can make an idol out of sex, out of marriage. They can also make an idol out of marriage. And what do we mean by that? We are called to worship God as believers, those of us who are, in God alone. Anything subsequent to God, no matter how good it is, if we place it above God, it can become an idol. And so you can have some societies that will really idolize a type of marriage and obviate a lot of this social truancy. But there'll be other problems on the other half of the equation.
Yeah, I was meaning a society where they have more strong community ties, not a family tie. For example, if the father died and the child grew up fatherless.
I'm sorry, absolutely. Yes, and see, what we do have in this country is we have the lost extended family. And a lot of that is a product of the Industrial Revolution, the product of post-World War II, commuting and communications and suburbia and so forth. I mean, it's amazing when I think of my family, and they are all across the planet, all across the United States in terms of where they live. And we don't have the privilege of growing up with grandfather, grandmother, or uncles and aunts the way we once did. And yes, that is true. And it's also true that where you have extended family, divorce rates are far lower, and promiscuity is far lower. And so we really have a challenge in this culture, because the culture is dead set against extended families, unless you're a radical like a Quaker
or like other people who really have tremendous and positive influences on keeping people close. And even the Quakers in Pennsylvania lose a lot of their kids in the big cities. Yes?
Hi, I'm Karen.
Okay.
I remember you saying that you've done a lot of work with feminist theology, is that correct?
Yes. Like
Yeah,
this is
I also noticed that you use the words he and his when you describe God.
He, yes.
And I was wondering if that was for convenience or for the fatherhood metaphor or the reason behind that.
That's a superb question, and I addressed that specifically in the book. And the subtitle of that section is the he of, how do I put it? Why is God called he? Or better question, why is Adam called he? And here's my simple observation. Well, let me back up a second. In Genesis 1:26-28, actually verse 27, when it says, in the image of God, God made man, male and female, he created them. Those are three lines in Hebrew structure, and they're in parallel form, which is the nature of Hebrew poetry. He, man, and male and female are parallel. Image of God, he, and them are all parallel. Now, what this is saying very powerfully is that the he pronoun includes, linguistically, male and female. Not only that, the word Adam, from where you get Adam, means male and female, whereas the Hebrew word zakar, or ish, refers to male, and not to man and woman together. Now, you see this ratified powerfully in Genesis 5. So sin has come in the world, you have the faithful lineage of Seth, the unfaithful lineage of Cain, and you have the beginning of tracing the lineage of Seth. And it says, and Adam was made in God's image, and his likeness, and Seth was, before that, it says, God made them male and female, and he then called them man. Now, what is being said linguistically and very powerfully, and this comes to the question of simplicity, it's very difficult to say he and she, or some languages do have pronouns that refer to male and female. A lot of Western languages do not, okay? And Hebrew did not. And so what happens is the Hebrew language says that Adam takes on the name of man and woman. And part of him taking on that name is that he is to regard the woman as his equal, as fully man in the generic sense as he is. And it's really a wonderful prescription against male chauvinism from the word go. And therefore, the use of he all the way through Scripture is inclusive of male and female in those contexts. If one is referring to Adam or Enosh, when it refers to male, Zakar or Ish, it's referring to male at that point, or Isha, woman, it would have the female pronoun. Now, the other element here, and the question I ask is, why is God called he? Is God a male? He's not a male in the biblical worldview. That's looking at it backwards. Because very clearly, male and female are made in God's image, which means all the qualities of male and female come from God himself. Now you see how I'm using himself as a pronoun. And also in the Scripture, you have God applying female metaphor to himself. One classic example is when Jesus, on his way to being crucified, lamented over Jerusalem. And he said, how long will I have gathered you under my wings as a mother hen gathers her chicks? And so you see, Jesus is free to applying a female metaphor to himself. And so my argument is this. The he of God does not describe a maleness, because male and female reflects the image of God. Rather, it describes the power to give. And the power to give, in order to happen, has got to be initiated. And that's why Adam is called the he. You see, you have to give to someone who needs to receive before they know how to give to someone else. So the first of the two humans in the complementary relationship that are created needs to receive and needs to give, and therefore the he becomes the one who reflects the he of God, which is the power to give. So when woman receives it, she becomes the she, which is related to that who receives and gives back, and the power to give is embraced at that point. And from that point on forward, both partners are completely delightfully free to initiate the creativity of the creator. Hope that's helpful. Yes, sir.
My name is Joel.
What am I hearing? Did you say Joel?
Joel, yes. This kind of might seem just like a plain, whatever, theological question. I was struck by a couple things you said. The first being that the potential for failure is also like a potential for success. Those
Yes.
are certain points. You also said that you were kind of, if I'm remembering you right, you said something about hating the devil and all that.
That we have the only object of hatred a Christian can have is the devil.
Okay.
Yeah,
And
not any human being.
right. And then you were also pretty adamant about the call to love one's enemy.
Absolutely.
And how, if the devil is kind of the ultimate enemy, and also potentially potential for failure and so potential for success, is a Christian now also called to love?
That's not a random question. That's a superb question. And let me phrase it with it. What you're saying is that if we are called to love our enemies, and we're called to embrace risk in the pursuit of success, and I said the only one we can hate is the devil, can we not, or should we not love the devil? Okay? Okay, let me make a radical statement. Hell is an object of God's love. The way I parse this is the following. There's a verse in the RSSB, again this is the Rankin substandard version, so don't quote this anywhere. It's taking John 3:16 and reading it into Genesis 2:16. For God so loved the world, he gave each one of us the freedom to choose to go to hell if we want to. This is the freedom of God's theological risk-taking nature. And I say that with very tight theological standards, which I can give for the definition someone wants to have me do it, in terms of Calvin and Arminian and that debate. But anyhow, the power to give itself, by not forcing, gives us the power to say no. And Jesus says that men love darkness instead of light because their deeds were evil. And if you trace all the way through Scripture, you will see that God gives us what and whom we love. And that is a most radical definition of justice. And if we love something other than him, he will give us what he loves. And if we love darkness, no matter how completely destructive it is, he will give it to us. Therefore, hell is an object of God's love. He loves us enough to let us say no and to have our own domain if we want to accept it, if we want to reject his love and graciousness. Now, having said that, okay, I will also argue that hate is far closer to love than apathy is in either direction. And so on that point, you say, love the devil. I can say theologically, yeah, the devil is loved. He was loved enough to make his own choice. But his choice is to deny us the power to give. Okay? And the best way we love him is by hating him. Because he will destroy us if we don't do otherwise. That was a great question. Let's go over here. Is this Maud again?
No.
No, my eyesight. Go ahead.
Ria?
What's the name?
Ria?
Am I hearing or they right? Spell that for me.
R-I-A.
Oh, Ria. Okay, great.
I was just wondering, could you tell me very simply, like maybe in just a few words, where you think homosexuality arises from?
Very simply, I think overwhelmingly dysfunctional families.
Okay, so...
But that won't, I just anticipate one thing.
Right.
That doesn't preclude precognizant identities. In other words, I'm going to argue it's not genetic, but I'm going to argue that a lot of people who view themselves homosexual genuinely believe they've always been that way. And I will not take that self-diagnosis away from them.
Okay, I identify as a lesbian, and saying that is the majority, I think you said, come from dysfunctional homes. I don't, and I don't come from an abusive home either.
Okay.
And I'm not sure.
And of course you understand that I have said it's not all cases.
Right, and I am not sure if I was always this way. So that kind of goes against also what you just said. So I'm just wondering.
Well, actually it doesn't, because if you parse all the nuances that's talking about, we might see some overlapping influences. But let me circle back and ask you a question. And thank you for your honesty in sharing your own sense of self-identity. You said you don't know that you've always been that way. So, is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay. So, do you have any sense of choice in terms of your identity as a lesbian?
I don't think so.
You don't think so? So, would you be saying that there are certain passive elements beyond your control, however they influence you?
Perhaps.
Okay.
I wouldn't say that I've always known this about myself, but
Right.
that when I did discover it, I don't think it was a choice that I consciously made, that it was
Okay.
something that did arise and that I am happy with. But there was one point that you made where you actually said the word sexual preference. Do you use that over the term sexual identity? Because I think the large part of the homosexual community would use the term sexual identity against sexual preference as it is not a preference, that it is not a choice. I was wondering.
Well, that's a good question again. I don't know what the best term to use is, and I'll tell you why. Not only did I study with a lot of homosexuals and do I interface with them as regularly as I can, I've seen the broadest spectrum of self-identity. I've seen people that is completely genetic and people completely choice. And in fact, at Smith College, I met a lot of lesbians who said choice, 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 and many times a political choice. So, and not only that, we look at issues of bisexuality. You know, what is that? Is that choice if it is going in both directions in terms of identity, or it becomes its own freestanding identity? And so what happens is, I try to use language, sexual preference, sexual orientation, sexual identity, and I have to tell you, anytime I ever use one term, and not all of them, someone challenges me. And so that's my sense of, among homosexuals, their use of terms. And so I don't mean anything by the term other than if it's helpful for me to communicate, and if you want to tell me there's a better way to communicate with you, then I want to respect that. And so what I hear you say is this is an identity.
Yeah, I think that at least a large part of the homosexual community in this college would argue that it is an identity and not a preference. I'm not sure what it is at other colleges, but I would think here that definitely.
And it's interesting. I have seen people speak of the homosexual identity and homosexuals saying, no, it's a preference, it's a choice, or it's not my choice, or whatever. But let me just press you a little bit more if I can. I have an identity, okay? And my identity is as a Christian, okay? It's something that modifies my given identity as a man and as a human being. Would you use the word identity in the same framework that I use it for myself?
I don't think so, because...
Okay. So it's more important, I don't know what words you want. Is it more important than you being a woman or being a human?
I think that I define myself not as a lesbian or even, I'm not sure where I am at all, so I wouldn't define myself as bisexual nor as a lesbian. I define myself more as a human being and as a woman and as a happy person.
Mm-hmm.
So
humanity and womanhood come first in your identity?
Yeah, but that's not to say that because they come first, the other one comes last. Maybe, I think that almost seems what you're trying to say, and I wouldn't place lesbianism or bisexualism as last in my identity, although it's not first.
And I don't place Christian last either, okay? But what I will say is this, is I'm a man regardless of what I try to do about it. Well, even if I did something about it, I'd still be a man. I would, okay? I am biologically created male, and I'm a human being, so I see those as unchanging, okay? But I see the Christianity, I see the homosexuality as changeable. By the same token, I'll tell you the following. I chose to believe in Jesus Christ. I could not choose otherwise. In other words, that identity will not change. I will die instead of changing that identity. And to me, that is a fulfillment of being a man, being a human being. And you are saying, I don't know if you are, I don't know what the words are you saying that a lesbian identity is a fulfillment of your humanity and your specific womanhood?
I don't know.
Okay, that's fair enough. This is why, by the way, I think a lot of the debate over this issue is ultimately religious. The mainline seminaries have a very high population of self-proclaimed gay and lesbian studying for the ministry. And in fact, half of the students at Harvard Divinity, according to the publication of the gay organization, they claim that half the students were gay or lesbian, and at Yale and places like that. And so I think there really is an identity contest at that point. And the most important thing I want to say to you is, regardless of any differences we have on that, my chosen obligation to you is to treat you as an image bearer of God and to make sure that I give you the same civil rights I have. And if we argue over marriages and civil rights, we will do it as basic human beings. Thank you. Yes, sir.
My name is Stephen.
Stephen? My ears and mics are working great. Please continue.
I'm also an international student, and I guess one of the things I have a question on is, in the sense like that, does Christianity in a sense need to be adapted, like truth?
Yeah, I'm not going to
The way I understand Christianity is it has developed in the Western context.
No, I don't understand true Christianity as developed in the Western context. It developed out of the ancient Near East, Jewishness. But the question is, at what point do we Western Christians put our Western identity over and against the biblical identity, and therefore skew the nature of Christianity.
That would be one question.
Yeah, and we've done a lot of it. But my passion is to be radical Hebrew, my understanding, and to go back to the ancient Near Eastern context. But even, and that's to culturally understand the language, the verbs, the construction of Hebrew language, and how best to translate and understand that. But the ancient Near East is completely human as we are here, or in the Far East.
Because I guess the thing I'm not sure, one of the things that challenges me is, it's kind of that, in a sense, like combining the way how I identify myself as Christian and how I, with my heritage, with my Chinese heritage.
Chinese, you said?
Yes.
Yeah. You know, it's remarkable, and I don't want to embarrass Katie O'Mealy, but she's a fourth year in Chinese and a language, and going to be doing some work next year in Taiwan. And I was just asking her yesterday about the Chinese language and the characters, because I know nothing about, almost nothing about Chinese language. I mean, I can say ping pong, that's about as close as I can get. And it's a great sport, I love it. You can get really tired playing a game of ping pong if you really roll. Anyhow, and so I asked her about the characters and conjunctives and verbs and syntax and whatnot, and she told me there's a book that talks about Christian symbolism in the very characters of Chinese language. And you may want to ask about this book, I want to read it. It shows back to the history of the Chinese language itself. There are a lot of biblical metaphors in the very pictographs, if that's the right way to talk about characters, that are 5,000, 6,000 years old. Here's my observation, is that when Christ comes to us, he comes to us in our culture, on our own terms. And if I'm to be an honest Christian, I'm going to learn from your humanity, your Chinese background. And my conclusion, without knowing a lot about it, is that you are equally as human as I am. For example, I like to speak about the image of God, equaling the following qualities. As image bearers of God, we are all made to seek peace, order, stability, and hope. To live, to love, to laugh, and to learn. And I get to find one person who's not seeking those qualities. And even in the two tragic cases in my life where I've known people who committed suicide, they both did so thinking it was more peaceful than what they had in their current distraught lives. And so if I assume that you, like me, are seeking the qualities of peace, order, stability, and hope, then I'm going to start at a point of that humanity in my expression of Christianity. Because see, I'm convinced that by sharing that understanding, going back to Genesis, is quintessentially Christian on its own terms, in terms of sharing with you. And I want to make sure that I don't bring my Western cultural baggage to you. And the most effective missionaries, in my mind, theologically, are those when they come into a foreign culture, study, learn, and love the culture. And that's, to me, what Jesus does when he came to the Jews in the first century, and that's what his Holy Spirit does as he comes to any of us anywhere. I argue at the end of my book at one point when I deal with race and class, that only Genesis has a universal view of human nature. Every pagan origin text views people as warring against other peoples and having separate origins. Genesis traces all back to one human, one man, one woman, to whom we've all come. And our linguistic, cultural differences, or skin color differences are all subsequent and result in the genetic pool of what it did over thousands of years. We're equally human.
I guess the other thing would be, I mean, if I said in the sense that ideas of Christianity,
Now, I apologize. I'm having a hard time understanding what you're saying.
I guess one of the things I was wondering about is because of because he says combining culture and religion, in a sense, and sometimes I kind of think like a lot of Chinese believe in what they call feng shui.
The Chinese believe in what?
Feng shui, in a sense, the interaction of the environment.
Okay.
In a sense,
Is that a Confucian teaching?
I do not think it is.
Is it a
It's
Taoist?
described in the book I Ching. I think it's Taoist.
I Ching.
Yes.
Okay.
Book of Ching.
Is that related to Taoism?
I
To
think
yin
so.
and yang?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to get a ballpark of what you're saying. So you're trying to reconcile the integration between the human and the environment
I mean,
with Christianity?
I have some understanding of the idea of its cosmos spiral. It's prescribed in the yin yang. The idea of the life force, you know? I mean, that's a really
Okay.
I mean,
Life force of I Ching.
and sometimes some of that makes sense to me.
Okay.
And I'm trying to figure out, because it seems like a somewhat opposing worldviews.
Okay.
And I'm not exactly sure it says in my cultural heritage, kind of prescribe that. Do I basically do this?
Let me try to sum up what I think you're saying, okay? That in the Chinese teaching of I Ching and the life force, which goes into a lot of its view of medicine and healing and things like that, you see many positive things about it, but you also view it as in conflict with certain Western views of Christianity. And how do you reconcile the conflict? Well, I will tell you this. Western medicine has many positive elements to it, but it also has many blind sides. And in one blind side for many years, well, my father, who was chief hematologist in the Harvard Hospital for years, would tell me years ago that 85% of all hospital beds were occupied by the psychosomatically ill. Not people who had any physical illness whatsoever, but their mind was causing what was happening in their body. And yet so much of Western medical model simply treats the body as separate from the mind. And from a biblical perspective, I disagree with the passion. And so I think the I Ching is actually more biblical at that point in seeing some of the unity. Now, the next element, and I speak out of not much knowledge about I Ching, but is that related also to acupuncture? Okay. Okay, I thought it was. I know that those who try to reconcile acupuncture with I Ching talk about the ions or something in the space between the molecules and how when you do the acupuncture you create something that Western medicine can't do. I am completely open to all of that because I believe that the scientific model, a lot of what they're talking about there is consistent with the scientific model. Now, where a lot of Christians in the Western motif would react against that is if they saw a Taoist philosophy coming into it. And part of the Taoist philosophy of the yin and yang is dualism. It says ultimately good and evil are equal. They're necessary complements and they are codependent. And that's phenomenally at odds with the biblical worldview. The biblical worldview does not say Satan has as much power as God. It says that God is good, Satan is a creature, and good will triumph. So in the dualistic model, of which the yin and yang of Taoism is one example, you don't have a confidence that good will triumph over evil. So what happens is many Christians respond to, say, I Ching or acupuncture or some of these medical philosophies or even psychological philosophies because they react against dualism, okay? And I would react against dualism also. But by the same token, I would say scientifically what is being said here. Is their understanding and their wisdom and their traditions necessarily derived from dualism, or is it something that's actually larger and more powerful? And I will go for the latter opinion from a lay and distant perspective. Thank you. And, okay. Yes, sir. And what we're going to do, timing-wise, is we're going to take this question here, and is there anyone else in line for questions over there? Okay, take these two questions and bring it to conclusion. Yes, go ahead.
My name is Joseph, and I'd like to start out and say thank you for coming to speak to us.
Well, it's been a joy. Thank you.
My question is pretty simple, but it's kind of hard to explain, so I'll try to get as good as I can. I've got a best friend who was brought up without a father. Her half-sister was brought up with a father. And surprisingly enough, it was kind of opposite of the study that you were speaking of. Although it was with males, and these are two females. The grandparents will even admit that they prefer the older daughter who was brought up without a father.
Okay.
The younger daughter being brought up with a father a little bit more, I guess you might say, playful and direct.
Okay.
Where do daughters fit into the picture that you were speaking of?
Okay.
And then the second part of the question is where
Could I answer this and then maybe come back to the second part because maybe I'll forget the first part or the second part while I answer the first part. So the question is, the study I talked about was young men incarcerated for serious crimes, and the study showed that 70 to 90% of them had grown up in functionally fatherless homes. Where do daughters fit into that? Daughters fit in the same way, except they don't express their aggression and pain in violent crime the way boys do. They express it in other dysfunctional and hurting capacities, one of which is sexual promiscuity, prostitution, or other levels of dysfunction. However, I'm speaking from more of a distance and not having read a study on the exact subject. Okay, so that's more of a supposition, an observation that I won't say I can back it up with anything other than observation in contrast with this study. What I will say is this, and as a father of four, our children, they need, the most important thing they need is to see mom and dad love each other. And if they see mom and dad loving each other and giving each other mutual respect, they know their love without even having to be told so. And so you have all the holistic elements. If you have marriages where mom and dad are fighting, I'll tell you, those kids can wind up worse than fatherless boys and fatherless girls. See, it all depends on what the influences are on those fatherless. You know, the Big Brothers program, that's specifically an attempt to give some surrogate fatherhood. And it's been wonderful for very many people. And so what happens is, and this is my argument, is the best approximation we can gain to a mom and dad loving each other, loving their kids, that's what we should aim for. And for every rule, there are exceptions to it. But I think that if you spent the time to talk with people in terms of their outcomes and what their influences in their lives were, I would argue consistently that we need male and female respecting and loving each other and respecting and loving us together. And quintessentially, that's what a biblical marriage is all about. Your second part.